The morning mist hung heavy over the cobblestones of Buckingham Palace as guard Thomas Mitchell adjusted his red tunic for what he thought would be another routine day. The 24-year-old soldier had been standing guard for nearly 6 months, and the rigid discipline had become second nature. His black bearskin hat sat perfectly straight, his rifle held at the precise angle, and his face maintained the stoic expression that had made the Queen's Guard famous worldwide. Thomas had grown up in a small village outside Manchester, where his grandmother had filled his childhood with stories about honor, duty, and protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. When he joined the military, these values became the foundation of his service. But nothing had prepared him for the moment when duty would clash with human compassion in the most unexpected way. It was barely past 9 in the morning when Thomas noticed the small figure approaching the palace gates. A little girl, no more than 5 years old, walked slowly toward his position. Her blonde curls were messy, her pink dress was wrinkled, and tears streamed down her cheeks. She carried a small stuffed rabbit that looked well-loved and slightly torn. What struck Thomas immediately was that she appeared to be completely alone. The girl stopped directly in front of him and looked up with wide blue eyes filled with confusion and fear. She stood there for several minutes, occasionally sniffling and wiping her nose with the back of her small hand. Thomas could see tourists beginning to gather, some taking photos of what they assumed was just another curious child posing with a guard. But something about her demeanor told him this was different. According to protocol, Thomas was required to remain motionless and silent, unless there was a direct threat to the royal family or the palace. Guards were trained to ignore distractions, whether they came from pushy tourists, protesters, or even children trying to get a reaction. The rules were clear and non-negotiable. Breaking character could result in disciplinary action, reassignment, or even dismissal from the prestigious position. But as the minutes passed, Thomas noticed more troubling details. The girl's dress was not just wrinkled, but appeared to have been slept in. Her shoes were scuffed and dirty, and she kept looking around as if searching for someone who wasn't there. Most concerning of all, she seemed genuinely lost and frightened, not just playing a game like most children who approach the guards. The crowd of onlookers grew larger, with people pointing cameras and smartphones at the scene. Some were laughing and making jokes about the cute situation, but Thomas could see that the little girl was becoming more distressed by the attention. She clutched her stuffed rabbit tighter and took a small step closer to him, as if seeking protection from the growing crowd. Thomas felt his training warring with his instincts. Every fiber of his military conditioning told him to remain perfectly still and let someone else handle the situation. Palace security would eventually notice the unaccompanied child and take appropriate action. The Metropolitan Police had procedures for dealing with lost children. It wasn't his responsibility, and it certainly wasn't worth risking his career over. But then the little girl did something that changed everything. She reached out with her tiny hand and gently touched his red tunic, just above his polished brass buttons. She looked up at him with those innocent blue eyes and whispered in a voice so soft that only he could hear it. "Please help me find my mummy," she said, her lower lip trembling. "I can't find her anywhere, and I'm scared." In that moment, Thomas saw his own younger sister in the girl's face. He remembered how Sarah used to look at him with that same expression of complete trust when she was frightened during thunderstorms or when she had nightmares. He thought about his grandmother's stories about real heroes being those who helped others when no one else would. The internal struggle lasted only seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Thomas made a decision that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, he began to bend his knees. The movement was so gradual that most of the crowd didn't notice immediately. But the little girl's eyes widened with hope as she realized the tall, imposing figure was coming down to her level. Thomas lowered himself into a careful crouch, his rifle still held properly, but his face now at the same height as the frightened child. The crowd fell silent, sensing that something unprecedented was happening. Cameras clicked frantically as tourists realized they were witnessing something extraordinary. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Thomas asked quietly, his voice gentle despite months of military conditioning. The little girl's face brightened slightly through her tears. "Emma," she replied, wiping her nose again. "Emma Rose Thompson." I was with Mummy at the big shop, but then there were so many people and I couldn't find her. A nice lady told me the soldiers here help people, so I came to find you." Thomas felt his heart breaking for this brave little girl who had somehow found her way to the palace in search of help. He glanced around quickly, noting that several palace security officers were now approaching, having noticed the unusual situation. He also spotted what appeared to be metropolitan police officers moving through the crowd. "You did exactly the right thing, Emma," Thomas said, maintaining his gentle tone while gesturing subtly to the approaching security team. "These other nice people are going to help us find your mummy right now. You're very brave for coming to ask for help." As the security officers took over the situation, Thomas slowly stood back to his full height and resumed his position. But the damage to his stoic facade had already been done. For the first time since beginning his service, he had broken character completely, and he had no regrets about it. The crowd dispersed slowly, many people clearly moved by what they had witnessed. Some were wiping away tears of their own, having been touched by the guard's compassion. Others were already posting videos and photos to social media, where the story would soon spread around the world. As Emma was led away by the kind security officers who would help reunite her with her frantic mother, she turned back and waved at Thomas with her small hand. He couldn't wave back while on duty, but he gave her the slightest nod, which made her smile for the first time since he had noticed her. Thomas returned to his duties, knowing that his moment of compassion had probably been recorded by dozens of cameras and would likely reach his commanding officers before his shift ended. He also knew that he would make the same choice again without hesitation if faced with a similar situation. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on guard James Wellington as he maintained his post outside Windsor Castle. The 31-year-old sergeant had served with distinction for 8 years, and his reputation for unwavering discipline was legendary among his peers. James had never broken protocol, never faltered in his duty, and never allowed his personal feelings to interfere with his professional responsibilities. Until today. The crowd of tourists was particularly thick this Wednesday afternoon, with families from around the world posing for photos and marveling at the pageantry of the British monarchy. James had grown accustomed to the constant attention, the flash of cameras, and the occasional attempt by visitors to make him smile or react. He had mastered the art of being simultaneously present and invisible, a living statue in service to the crown. Among the crowd, James noticed an elderly gentleman who had been standing near the gates for over an hour. The man appeared to be in his late 70s, with silver hair neatly combed and a worn but dignified suit that suggested better days. What caught James's attention wasn't just the man's prolonged presence, but the way he carried himself with the unmistakable bearing of a fellow soldier. The elderly visitor held himself straight despite his age, and James could see the telltale signs of military service in his posture and the way he observed his surroundings. Most telling of all, the man wore a small pin on his lapel that James recognized as a distinguished service medal, though from this distance he couldn't make out the specific details. As the afternoon wore on, James noticed the elderly gentleman beginning to struggle with the heat. The man's face had grown flushed and he was swaying slightly on his feet. Despite his obvious discomfort, the veteran continued to stand at attention, as if he were on parade himself. James could see that the man was fighting to maintain his dignity even as his body began to fail him. The situation became critical when the elderly gentleman suddenly stumbled and began to fall backward. The crowd around him was too distracted by their sightseeing to notice his distress. James watched in horror as the man's knees buckled, knowing that a fall at that age could result in serious injury or worse. Without thinking, James broke from his position and rushed forward, catching the elderly gentleman just before he hit the ground. The crowd gasped in surprise as they witnessed the guard abandoning his post, but James paid no attention to their reactions. His focus was entirely on the man in his arms, who was now unconscious and breathing shallowly. "Someone call an ambulance," James shouted, his voice cutting through the murmur of confused tourists. He carefully lowered the gentleman to the ground and checked his pulse, drawing on the first aid training that was part of every guard's preparation. The pulse was weak but steady, and the man's breathing, while shallow, was regular. As James knelt beside the unconscious veteran, he noticed the man's medals more clearly. Along with the Distinguished Service Medal, he wore ribbons indicating service in the Falklands War and several other conflicts. This was a man who had served his country with honor, and James felt a deep sense of responsibility to ensure his welfare. A woman in the crowd, who identified herself as a nurse, rushed forward to help. Together, they positioned the elderly gentleman in the recovery position and monitored his vital signs while waiting for emergency services to arrive. James remained by the man's side, offering reassurance and maintaining a calm presence, even as palace security officers approached to assess the situation. "I'm not moving until the paramedics arrive," James told the security team firmly when they suggested he return to his post. "This man is a veteran, and he needs help right now. My duty is to serve and protect, and that's exactly what I'm doing." The security officers, recognizing the gravity of the situation and James's commitment to helping, coordinated with the approaching emergency services rather than insisting he resume his ceremonial duties. The crowd had formed a respectful circle around the scene, with many people clearly moved by the guards' compassion and quick action. When the paramedics arrived, they quickly assessed the elderly gentleman's condition and determined that he was suffering from heat exhaustion and dehydration. As they prepared to transport him to the hospital, the man regained consciousness and looked up to see James still kneeling beside him. "Thank you, son," the veteran whispered, his voice weak but clear. "You didn't have to break ranks for an old soldier like me, but I'm grateful you did." James helped the paramedics load the stretcher into the ambulance, and before the doors closed, he learned that the elderly gentleman was Arthur Morrison, a decorated veteran who had been visiting the castle as part of a personal pilgrimage to honor fallen comrades. Arthur had lost his wife recently and had been struggling with loneliness and depression, which may have contributed to his neglect of his own health. As the ambulance pulled away, James found himself surrounded by tourists who had witnessed the entire incident. Many were taking photos and videos, but the mood was respectful rather than sensational. Several people approached to thank him for his actions, and one elderly woman hugged him with tears in her eyes. "My husband was a soldier too," she said, softly. "He would have been so proud to see what you did today. That man could have been him, and you treated him with the dignity he deserved." When James's commanding officer arrived to assess the situation, he found a guard who was prepared to accept whatever consequences might come from abandoning his post. James stood at attention and gave a clear, honest report of the events, taking full responsibility for his decision to break protocol. "Sir, I understand that I violated standing orders by leaving my position," James said formally. "I accept full responsibility for my actions and am prepared for any disciplinary measures you deem appropriate. However, I want it noted that I would make the same decision again under identical circumstances." The commanding officer studied James for a long moment before responding. "Sergeant Wellington, the Queen's Guard exists to serve and protect. Today you served with distinction and protected a man who had served his country with honor. Your actions reflect the best traditions of this regiment and the British Army." Rather than facing punishment, James discovered that his actions had been recorded by multiple tourists and had already begun circulating on social media. The videos showed not just his quick response to help Arthur, but also the respect and dignity with which he had treated the elderly veteran throughout the incident. The story reached Arthur's family, who had been searching for him after he failed to return home from his planned visit to Windsor. They were able to visit him in the hospital, where he made a full recovery. Arthur's daughter later wrote to James explaining that her father had been struggling with depression since losing his wife, and that the kindness shown by a fellow serviceman had given him renewed hope and purpose. The incident became a powerful reminder that true honor sometimes requires breaking the rules in service of a higher purpose. James returned to his duties the following day, with a deeper understanding of what it meant to serve, knowing that the rigid discipline of his position should never overshadow the fundamental human compassion that made such service meaningful. Guard Michael Davies had always prided himself on his ability to maintain perfect composure under any circumstances. At 28 years old, he had served as a Queen's Guard for 4 years, and had seen everything from marriage proposals conducted in front of his post to protesters attempting to climb the palace gates. Nothing had ever caused him to break his stoic demeanor until the day an unexpected visitor changed everything. It was a crisp October morning when Michael noticed a middle-aged woman approaching his position at St. James's Palace. What made her different from the usual stream of tourists was her deliberate, purposeful walk and the way she looked directly at him rather than at the palace behind him. She carried a small bouquet of white roses and walked with the careful dignity of someone carrying a heavy emotional burden. The woman stopped directly in front of Michael's position and stood quietly for several minutes. Unlike most visitors who took quick photos and moved on, she seemed content to simply stand and observe. Michael could see that she was fighting back tears, and there was something in her expression that suggested a deep, personal connection to this place. After nearly half an hour of silent observation, the woman stepped closer to Michael and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. Her words were meant only for him, and they would haunt him for the rest of his life. "Excuse me," she said softly. "I know you can't respond, but I need to tell you something. My son David served as a guard here 3 years ago. He was so proud of this position, so honored to serve. He used to write letters home describing how important it felt to be part of this tradition." Michael felt his heart skip a beat as he realized where this conversation was heading. The woman's voice remained steady, but he could see the tremendous effort it took for her to continue speaking. "David was killed in Afghanistan 2 years ago," she continued, her voice becoming even quieter. "Today would have been his 30th birthday. I brought these flowers because I wanted to honor his memory at the place where he was happiest. I wanted to stand where he stood and remember the pride in his voice when he called home after his first day of duty." The woman, who Michael now understood was a Gold Star mother, paused to compose herself before continuing. "I know you can't break your duties to acknowledge me, but I was hoping you might understand what this place meant to him and what it means to me to be here today." Michael felt tears threatening to break through his carefully maintained composure. He thought about his own mother and how devastated she would be to lose him. He imagined this brave woman's son standing in the very spot where he now stood, feeling the same pride and sense of duty that Michael experienced every day. The mother placed the white roses carefully at the base of the small barrier near Michael's post, arranging them with the tender care of someone performing a sacred ritual. David always said the hardest part of being a guard wasn't the physical demands or the long hours of standing still. It was maintaining dignity and honor while people treated you like a tourist attraction instead of a soldier serving his country. She spoke. A group of rowdy teenagers approached and began making loud jokes about trying to make the guard laugh. They were completely oblivious to the emotional scene unfolding just feet away from them. One of the teenagers pulled out his phone and started filming, while another made exaggerated faces and ridiculous poses. Michael watched as the grieving mother's face tightened with pain and anger at the disrespectful behavior. This was exactly the kind of treatment her son had described in his letters, and seeing it happen during her moment of remembrance was clearly devastating. The teenagers continued their antics, growing louder and more disruptive, completely unaware of the pain they were causing. The situation reached a breaking point when one of the teenagers decided to pose for a selfie directly in front of the white roses, carelessly kicking the bouquet aside to get a better angle. The flowers scattered across the pavement, and Michael watched as the mother's carefully arranged tribute to her fallen son was thoughtlessly destroyed. In that moment, Michael made a decision that would define his character forever. Slowly and deliberately, he took one step forward from his post. The movement was subtle but unmistakable, and it immediately caught the attention of both the disrespectful teenagers and the grieving mother. With careful precision, Michael bent down and began gathering the scattered white roses. His movements were slow and respectful, treating each flower as if it were a precious relic. The teenagers fell silent, finally realizing that something significant was happening. Other tourists who had been watching also grew quiet, sensing the gravity of the moment. Michael carefully rearranged the bouquet exactly as the mother had placed it, ensuring that each rose was positioned with the same care and dignity she had shown. When he finished, he slowly returned to his position, but not before making direct eye contact with the grieving mother and giving her the slightest, most respectful nod imaginable. The mother's eyes filled with tears, but for the first time since she had arrived, they were tears of gratitude rather than grief. She placed her hand over her heart and mouthed the words "thank you" in a gesture that conveyed more emotion than any spoken words could have expressed. The teenagers, thoroughly chastened by witnessing this display of respect and honor, quietly moved away from the area. Several other tourists who had observed the interaction were visibly moved, with some wiping away their own tears. The atmosphere around Michael's post had transformed from one of casual sightseeing to something approaching reverence. The mother spent another hour standing near Michael's position, and during that time she shared more stories about her son David. She spoke about his childhood dreams of military service, his pride in being selected for the Queen's Guard, and the letters he had sent describing his fellow guards as the most honorable men he had ever served alongside. David wrote that being a guard taught him that true strength isn't about standing perfectly still or following orders without question, she said. True strength is about knowing when those rules serve a higher purpose and when human compassion demands something more. As the morning wore on, other visitors to the palace began to notice the white roses and the obvious reverence with which they had been placed. Several people inquired about their significance, and when they learned the story from other tourists who had witnessed the scene, many chose to observe a moment of silence out of respect for the fallen soldier. When Michael's shift ended and he was replaced by another guard, the mother approached him one final time as he prepared to leave. "Thank you for honoring David's memory," she said, her voice steady and strong. "What you did today showed me that the values he believed in, the reasons he was so proud to serve, are still alive in the men who stand where he once stood." Michael, now able to speak freely, replied with heartfelt sincerity, "Ma'am, your son's sacrifice and service will never be forgotten. It was an honor to serve alongside him, even if only in spirit, and it was my privilege to ensure his memory was treated with the respect it deserves." The mother embraced Michael briefly before leaving, but not before making one final request. "Would you mind if I came back next year on his birthday? It would mean so much to me to know that someone who understands the importance of this place will be here to remember him with me." Michael assured her that she would always be welcome, and that David's memory would be honored by every guard who served at that post. As she walked away, Michael realized that his small act of breaking protocol had created something far more significant than a moment of compassion. It had created a living memorial to honor a fallen comrade and comfort a grieving mother. Incident was captured by several tourists and shared widely on social media. But rather than focusing on the rule-breaking aspect, the story became a powerful reminder of the human element behind the ceremonial duties of the Queen's Guard. The rain had been falling steadily for hours when Guard Robert Chen took his position outside Buckingham Palace that gray November morning. At 26 years old, Robert had been serving as a Queen's Guard for 2 years, and he had developed an almost supernatural ability to remain motionless, despite weather conditions that would send most people running for shelter. Today, however, the universe would test not just his physical endurance, but the very core of his humanity. The downpour had driven away most of the usual crowd of tourists, leaving only the most dedicated sightseers huddled under umbrellas and the occasional jogger racing past to escape the weather. Robert stood at his post in perfect formation, rain streaming off his bearskin hat and red tunic, his rifle held at the precise angle required by centuries of military tradition. Through the curtain of rain, Robert noticed a young woman approaching the palace gates. She moved slowly, seemingly oblivious to the weather soaking through her thin jacket. As she drew closer, Robert could see that she was probably in her early 20s, with dark hair plastered to her head by the rain and an expression of desperate determination on her face. What concerned Robert immediately was that the woman appeared to be in some kind of distress that went far beyond discomfort from the weather. Her movements were erratic, and she kept looking over her shoulder as if she feared being followed. Most alarming of all, she was clearly pregnant, and her condition was quite advanced. The young woman stopped directly in front of Robert's position and looked up at him with eyes filled with fear and desperation. She stood there for several minutes, rain pouring down her face, before speaking in a voice that was barely audible above the sound of the downpour. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. "I don't know where else to go. He's going to find me, and I can't let him hurt my baby. I heard that the guards here protect people. Please, I just need somewhere safe until I can figure out what to do." Robert felt his heart racing as he processed what the young woman was telling him. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to help her, but his training demanded that he remain motionless and silent. Palace security would handle any genuine emergencies, and there were proper channels for people seeking help or reporting crimes. But as Robert looked down at the frightened pregnant woman, he could see bruises on her arms that were partially hidden by her jacket sleeves. Her lip was swollen, and there was a fresh cut above her left eyebrow. This wasn't a case of someone seeking attention or trying to create a scene for social media. This was a woman in genuine danger, and she had come to him for protection. The situation became more urgent when Robert spotted a tall, angry-looking man pushing through the sparse crowd of tourists clearly searching for someone. The man's aggressive body language and the way he was scanning faces suggested he was looking for the pregnant woman. When his eyes locked onto her position near Robert's post, his expression became murderous. "There you are, you stupid girl," the man shouted as he approached, his voice carrying clearly despite the rain. "Did you really think you could run away from me? Get over here right now, or you'll regret it when we get home." The young woman visibly recoiled at the sound of his voice, instinctively stepping closer to Robert's position as if seeking protection. Her hands moved protectively to her swollen belly, and Robert could see that she was shaking with fear rather than cold. "I'm not going back with you, Marcus," she said, her voice stronger than Robert had expected. "I won't let you hurt our baby. The way you've been hurting me, I'm done being your punching bag." Marcus's face twisted with rage as he approached, completely ignoring the presence of the armed guard just feet away. "You don't get to make that choice," he snarled, reaching out to grab the woman's arm. "You belong to me, and so does that baby. Now stop making a scene and come home before I really lose my temper." Robert watched in horror as Marcus grabbed the pregnant woman's wrist and began trying to drag her away from the palace gates. She struggled against his grip, crying out in pain as he twisted her arm. The few tourists who were still in the area began to notice the commotion, but they seemed uncertain about whether to intervene in what appeared to be a domestic dispute. The moment of truth came when Marcus raised his free hand as if to strike the pregnant woman. Robert could see the terror in her eyes as she tried to shield her belly from the anticipated blow. In that instant, every rule, regulation, and protocol became secondary to the fundamental human duty to protect the innocent. Without hesitation, Robert stepped forward from his post and placed himself between Marcus and the pregnant woman. His 6'2" frame and impressive military bearing, combined with the authority of his uniform and the rifle in his hands, created an imposing barrier that brought Marcus's aggressive advance to an immediate halt. "Sir, I need you to step back immediately," Robert said in his most commanding military voice. "You will not lay another hand on this woman while I am standing here." Marcus's expression shifted from rage to confusion, and then to indignation. "This is none of your business, soldier boy," he spat. "This is between me and my girlfriend. You can't interfere with a private matter." "Domestic violence is not a private matter," Robert replied firmly, never taking his eyes off Marcus while simultaneously calling for backup using the subtle hand signals he had been trained to use in emergency situations. "This woman is seeking protection, and I am duty-bound to provide it." The confrontation attracted the attention of palace security officers, who quickly surrounded the scene. The pregnant woman, now safely behind Robert's protective barrier, began telling the officers about the months of abuse she had endured and her desperate attempt to escape before her baby was born. Marcus, faced with the combined authority of multiple security personnel and the unwavering presence of an armed guard, finally backed down. As he was led away by police officers who had been called to the scene, he continued to shout threats and accusations, but his power to intimidate had been broken by Robert's intervention. The young woman, whose name was Sarah, was taken to a secure location where she could receive medical attention and connect with social services designed to help victims of domestic violence. Before she left, she turned to Robert with tears streaming down her face. "Thank you for believing me," she said softly. "Thank you for protecting us when no one else would. You saved my baby's life today, and I will never forget that." Robert's commanding officer arrived to assess the situation and found a guard who was prepared to accept full responsibility for abandoning his post. But after hearing the complete story from witnesses and security personnel, the officer's response was not what Robert had expected. "Guard Chen," the officer said formally, "your primary duty as a member of Her Majesty's forces is to serve and protect. Today you served with exceptional courage and protected a vulnerable citizen from serious harm. Your actions reflect the highest traditions of military service." The incident was recorded by several security cameras and witness phones, and the footage quickly spread across social media platforms. Rather than focusing on the protocol violation, the public response overwhelmingly praised Robert's courage and compassion. The video became a powerful symbol of what it meant to use authority responsibly in service of those who needed protection. Sarah later wrote to Robert from the safe house where she was staying, informing him that she had given birth to a healthy baby girl and had named her Hope in honor of what his intervention had given her. She had also successfully obtained a restraining order against Marcus and was beginning to rebuild her life with the help of support services. The story became a reminder that true honor sometimes requires individuals to choose between following orders and following their conscience, and that the greatest acts of heroism often come from ordinary people who refuse to stand by while others suffer. Guard Christopher Hamilton had served at various royal residences for 3 years, but his assignment to Windsor Castle during the summer tourist season presented unique challenges. The 29-year-old soldier from Edinburgh had always been known for his exceptional discipline and his ability to maintain perfect composure, even under the most trying circumstances. But nothing in his extensive training had prepared him for the profound moment of human connection that would occur on a seemingly ordinary Tuesday afternoon in July. The day had been unusually busy, with tour groups from around the world creating a constant stream of visitors eager to photograph the famous guards in their iconic red tunics and towering bearskin hats. Christopher had grown accustomed to being treated more like a living monument than a human being, with tourists posing beside him for selfies, while discussing him as if he were deaf or invisible. Among the crowd that afternoon was a group of elderly visitors from a local care home, accompanied by their caregivers for what was clearly a special outing. Most of the group moved slowly through the castle grounds, taking their time to appreciate the historic surroundings and sharing memories of previous visits from decades past, but one member of the group caught Christopher's particular attention. An elderly gentleman, probably in his late 80s, had separated himself from the main group and was standing directly in front of Christopher's position. Unlike the casual tourists who typically spent a few minutes taking photos before moving on, this man stood with the unmistakable bearing of a career military officer. His spine was straight despite his advanced age, his shoulders were squared, and his eyes held the sharp, assessing gaze of someone who had commanded respect in his younger days. What made the encounter even more significant was the collection of medals pinned to the elderly gentleman's cardigan. Christopher could see campaign ribbons from World War II Korea and what appeared to be decorations for distinguished service spanning several decades of military career. This was clearly a veteran of extraordinary service and experience. The elderly man, whose caregiver had identified him to others as Colonel Edward Whitmore, stood at attention in front of Christopher for nearly 20 minutes. During this time, his military bearing never wavered, even though Christopher could see the physical effort it required for someone of his age to maintain such perfect posture for an extended period. As the minutes passed, Christopher began to notice that Colonel Whitmore was not simply observing him as a tourist attraction. Instead, the elderly officer was conducting what appeared to be an informal inspection, examining Christopher's uniform, posture, and bearing with the critical eye of someone who had once been responsible for maintaining similar standards in his own troops. The situation took an unexpected turn when Colonel Whitmore began to speak, not to the gathered tourists or his caregivers, but directly to Christopher in the clear, authoritative voice of a commanding officer. "Outstanding turnout, Guard," the colonel said formally, his voice carrying the crisp precision of decades of military command. "Your uniform is impeccable, your bearing is exemplary, and your discipline is a credit to your regiment and your country." Christopher felt a surge of pride at the unexpected praise, even though protocol required him to remain silent and motionless. Receiving recognition from a fellow serviceman, especially one with such obvious credentials and experience, meant more than any civilian could understand. But Colonel Whitmore wasn't finished. As his caregiver approached to encourage him to rejoin the group, the elderly officer continued his impromptu address. "I served for 43 years, young man," he said, his voice becoming slightly softer but no less authoritative. "I commanded men in 3 different conflicts, and I've seen courage and dedication in many forms. But there's something special about the discipline required for ceremonial duty. It takes a different kind of strength to serve your country while people treat you like a tourist attraction." The colonel paused, and Christopher could see that he was struggling with some internal emotion. When he continued speaking, his voice carried the weight of decades of experience and the wisdom that comes from a lifetime of service. "I'm 87 years old," Colonel Whitmore said, his words now clearly intended for Christopher alone despite the growing crowd of onlookers. "I've been fighting cancer for 2 years, and today is probably the last time I'll be able to visit this place that has meant so much to me throughout my military career. I wanted to stand here one more time and see the tradition I helped preserve being carried on by men like you." Christopher felt his heart breaking for this proud old soldier, who was facing the end of his service to life itself with the same dignity he had apparently brought to his military career. The colonel's caregiver was now gently trying to encourage him to return to the group, explaining that they needed to head back to the care home soon. "Just one more minute, please," Colonel Whitmore asked his caregiver politely. "I need to complete my final inspection." In that moment, Christopher made a decision that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Slowly and deliberately, he brought his rifle up to the present arms position, executing a perfect military salute in honor of the distinguished officer standing before him. The movement was crisp, precise, and unmistakably respectful. Christopher held the salute for a full 10 seconds, maintaining perfect form while looking directly into Colonel Whitmore's eyes. The elderly officer's face transformed with surprise and then profound gratitude as he realized he was receiving the military honors he deserved. Colonel Whitmore immediately responded by bringing his own weathered hand to his forehead in a return salute that, despite his advanced age and physical frailty, was executed with the muscle memory of decades of military service. For those few seconds, the 2 men stood connected across generations of service, honoring the tradition that bound them together as brothers in arms. The crowd of tourists had fallen completely silent, sensing that they were witnessing something far more significant than a typical guard interaction. Many were visibly moved by the exchange, with several elderly visitors wiping away tears as they recognized the profound respect being shown between 2 soldiers, separated by decades, but united by shared values of duty and honor. When both men lowered their salutes, Colonel Whitmore spoke once more, his voice now thick with emotion but still carrying the strength of his military training. "Thank you, son," he said simply. "In all my years of service, I've never been more proud to be part of the same tradition that you represent today. You've given an old soldier one of the greatest honors of his life." Christopher returned to his ceremonial position, but not before giving Colonel Whitmore the slightest nod of acknowledgement and respect. The elderly officer stood for another minute, clearly savoring the moment before his caregiver gently helped him rejoin his group for the journey back to the care home. As Colonel Whitmore was being helped into the transport van, he turned back one final time and raised his hand in a final farewell to Christopher. The guard, still bound by his ceremonial duties, could not wave back, but his respectful bearing conveyed all the acknowledgement and gratitude that words could not express. The interaction was captured by several tourists on their phones, and the videos quickly spread across social media platforms. But unlike many viral videos of guards breaking protocol, this one was met with universal praise and respect. Veterans organizations shared it as an example of the timeless bonds that connect military personnel across generations. The video became a powerful reminder that beneath the ceremonial uniforms and rigid protocols were real people who understood and honored the sacrifices of those who had served before them. Christopher's commanding officers, rather than disciplining him for the protocol violation, commended him for his exceptional judgment in recognizing and honoring a distinguished veteran. The incident became part of the unofficial training for new guards, serving as an example of how rigid adherence to rules should never prevent appropriate recognition of service and sacrifice. 3 weeks later, Christopher received a letter from the care home informing him that Colonel Whitmore had passed away peacefully in his sleep. The staff wrote that the elderly officer had spent his final days telling everyone about his encounter with the young guard at Windsor Castle, describing it as one of the most meaningful experiences of his later years. The letter also included a small package containing Colonel Whitmore's military medals, along with a note he had written before his death. The note read, "These medals represent a lifetime of service to our country. I cannot think of anyone more deserving to carry on the traditions they represent. Wear them with the same honor you showed me that day at Windsor." Christopher was deeply moved by the gift, but after consultation with his commanding officers and Colonel Whitmore's family, he decided that the medals should be donated to the regimental museum where they could honor the colonel's memory while inspiring future generations of guards. However, he kept the handwritten note, which became one of his most treasured possessions. The story of Christopher and Colonel Whitmore became legendary within the Queen's Guard, serving as a powerful reminder that their ceremonial duties were about more than pageantry and tradition. They were the living embodiment of values that connected them to every generation of servicemen who had stood guard over the same ideals of duty, honor, and service to something greater than themselves. Years later, Christopher would tell new recruits that the most important lesson he learned that day was that true military bearing sometimes requires the courage to break minor rules in service of major principles. The rigid discipline of ceremonial duty was important, but it should never prevent recognition of the human dignity and sacrifice that made such ceremonies meaningful in the first place. The Christmas season at Buckingham Palace brought a special kind of magic to the streets of London, but for Guard Daniel Murphy, the festive atmosphere only highlighted the loneliness and desperation of those who had nowhere to celebrate. At 32 years old, Daniel was one of the most senior guards in his unit, known for his unwavering discipline and his ability to mentor younger soldiers in the demanding requirements of ceremonial duty. But on this cold December evening, he would face a situation that would test not just his training but his fundamental beliefs about duty, compassion, and what it truly meant to serve. The snow had been falling steadily since early afternoon, creating a picturesque winter wonderland around the palace gates. Most tourists had retreated to warm pubs and hotels, leaving only a few hardy sightseers and the occasional late-night reveler making their way through the increasingly deserted streets. Daniel stood at his post in the falling snow, his red tunic and black bearskin hat creating a striking silhouette against the white landscape. It was nearly 11 o'clock when Daniel noticed the small figure huddled against the palace railings, about 50 yards from his position. At first, he assumed it was just another homeless person seeking shelter from the storm, a common sight in London that he had unfortunately grown accustomed to seeing. But as the minutes passed and the figure remained motionless despite the worsening weather conditions, Daniel began to feel a growing sense of concern. Through the swirling snow, Daniel could see that the person appeared to be quite small, possibly a child or a very young adult. They were wearing what looked like inadequate clothing for the harsh weather, and they had been in the same position for over an hour without moving. Most troubling of all, Daniel could see no signs of life, no visible breathing, no shifting for warmth, no response to the increasingly dangerous cold. The temperature had dropped well below freezing, and the combination of snow and wind was creating conditions that could easily prove fatal to someone without proper shelter or warm clothing. Daniel knew that hypothermia could set in quickly under such circumstances, and that a person could lose consciousness and die within hours if they remained exposed to the elements. As Daniel watched, fighting against every instinct that told him to investigate, he tried to convince himself that palace security or the Metropolitan Police would handle the situation if intervention was truly needed. There were protocols for dealing with people who appeared to be in distress near royal properties, and those protocols specifically excluded guards from abandoning their ceremonial posts to provide assistance. But as another hour passed without any change in the figure's condition, Daniel began to suspect that the usual safety nets might not be functioning properly on this snowy Christmas Eve. The severe weather had likely reduced patrols and stretched emergency services thin across the city. It was possible that this person had been overlooked in the general chaos of the storm. The situation reached a critical point when Daniel realized he could no longer see any signs of breathing or movement from the huddled figure. The person appeared to have lost consciousness, which in these weather conditions could quickly become life-threatening. Snow was beginning to accumulate on and around the motionless form, suggesting they had been unconscious for some time. Daniel faced an impossible choice. His duty as a guard required him to remain at his post regardless of external circumstances. Abandoning his position could result in serious disciplinary action, including potential dismissal from the prestigious unit he had worked years to join. But his duty as a human being demanded that he act to save a life that appeared to be hanging in the balance. The internal struggle lasted only moments before Daniel's fundamental decency won out over his military conditioning. Without hesitation, he left his post and ran through the snow toward the motionless figure, his heavy military boots slipping slightly on the increasingly treacherous pavement. As he approached, Daniel could see that his instincts had been correct. The person was a young man, probably in his late teens, and he was clearly suffering from severe hypothermia. His lips were blue, his breathing was shallow and irregular, and his skin was pale and cold to the touch. Most alarming of all, he was only semi-conscious and unable to respond coherently to Daniel's attempts to rouse him. "Can you hear me?" Daniel asked urgently, kneeling beside the young man and checking for signs of serious injury. "What's your name? How long have you been out here?" The young man's response was barely intelligible, but Daniel was able to understand that his name was Alex and that he had been on the streets for several days after being kicked out of a youth hostel. Alex appeared to be suffering from more than just exposure to the cold. Daniel could see signs of malnutrition and exhaustion that suggested he had been struggling to survive for some time. Without hesitation, Daniel removed his own military greatcoat and wrapped it around the shivering young man. The coat was designed to provide warmth in harsh conditions, and Daniel hoped it would help stabilize Alex's body temperature until proper medical help could arrive. "Stay with me, Alex," Daniel said firmly while using his radio to call for emergency services. "Help is coming, but I need you to keep talking to me. Tell me about yourself. Do you have family? Is there someone we can call?" As they waited for the ambulance, Daniel learned Alex's heartbreaking story. The 18-year-old had been in foster care until recently, but had aged out of the system without adequate support or resources. He had been trying to find work and stable housing, but had run out of money and options. Too proud to beg and too desperate to give up, he had been sleeping rough while continuing to search for employment during the day. "I didn't want to bother anyone," Alex whispered through chattering teeth. "I just needed somewhere to rest where I wouldn't get moved along by the police. I must have fallen asleep and then I couldn't get warm anymore." Daniel felt his heart breaking for this young man, who had been failed by every system designed to protect vulnerable people. Here was someone who had been trying to build a life for himself despite overwhelming obstacles, and who had nearly died simply because he had nowhere safe to sleep on a cold night. When the paramedics arrived, they quickly confirmed Daniel's assessment that Alex was suffering from severe hypothermia and would require immediate hospitalization. As they prepared to transport him to the emergency room, Alex grabbed Daniel's hand with surprising strength. "Thank you for not walking past me like everyone else," Alex said, his voice still weak, but filled with genuine gratitude. "I thought I was going to die out there and nobody would even know or care." "Everyone matters," Daniel replied firmly. "You matter, and your life has value. Don't ever forget that." As the ambulance pulled away, Daniel returned to his post to face whatever consequences might result from his decision to abandon his duties. His commanding officer arrived within minutes, having been notified of the situation by palace security cameras that had captured the entire incident. "Guard Murphy," the officer said formally, "you left your post without authorization to provide assistance to a civilian. Please explain your actions." Daniel stood at attention and provided a complete, honest account of what he had observed and the decisions he had made. He took full responsibility for violating protocol and expressed his willingness to accept whatever punishment was deemed appropriate. The commanding officer listened carefully to Daniel's report before responding. "Guard Murphy, you saved a young man's life tonight. Your actions demonstrated the highest values of military service and human decency. There will be no disciplinary action, and your conduct will be noted as exemplary in your service record." The story of Daniel and Alex spread quickly through both traditional and social media, becoming a powerful symbol of compassion during the Christmas season. But more importantly, the incident sparked conversations about homelessness, youth services, and the responsibility of society to care for its most vulnerable members. Alex made a full recovery, and, with help from social services and several charitable organizations that had been moved by his story, was able to find stable housing and employment. He sent Daniel a Christmas card every year afterward, updating him on his progress and thanking him for the second chance at life that his intervention had provided. Daniel's actions became part of the unofficial legend of the Queen's Guard, demonstrating that true honor sometimes requires individuals to choose compassion over compliance, humanity over protocol, and moral courage over personal safety.